Welcome to Season 4 of She Ventures. I am your host, Doria Lavanino. She Ventures is a podcast about women who are pivoting in their lives and careers. We live in a world where women of color founders raise 0.5% of all venture capital in 2020, and women overall, a paltry 2.2%. This podcast is about elevating women's voices. Our new website, sheventurespodcast.com, provides resources, actionable tips, mentorship, and community. We do not subscribe to the idea that there is a dearth of fundable ideas from women. There is no pipeline problem. There may be a visibility problem, and that is what we are here to fix together. Let's talk about the reality of women, money, entrepreneurship, and work-life balance on this season of She Ventures. She spent 2 decades as a mental health professional, first as a certified life coach and psychotherapist in private practice, to expanding her work to becoming principal and CEO of her own company, Behavioral Health Consulting Services, offering corporate employee wellness to executives and employees alike. Her focus, talent retention, job satisfaction, and to reduce absenteeism and burnout, which I am sure she has seen a lot of as of late, particularly among Black and Latinx employees. She is also author of the book, Adulting as a Millennial, A Guide to Everything Your Parents Didn't Teach You. Asha Tarry, welcome to She Ventures.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yes, and it is a pleasure to have you on. We're living in a time when the workplace is undergoing an extraordinary transition as we deal with COVID-19. How has that changed your workday personally?
Well, it definitely made my day slightly more full. I was already in private practice for several years before the pandemic hit, and I was seeing a lot of clients individually and in couples therapy as well as in group. But during the pandemic, what made my practice shift wasn't really more clients, but the needs of the clients. So this is the first time in my career, and I've been doing mental health work for 21 years, that I've written the most leaves of absence for people from work than ever before. I've never seen so many people actually lead the path to wellness as I've seen this particular year. And so that really included a lot more coordinated care with physicians and insurance companies. That included a lot more people seeking respite, believing how tired and exhausted they were, and advocating for themselves.
Do you think that the workplace has changed forever?
I think it's shifting. I can't say it'll be forever because what I've already seen and in some ways expected was the return to grind culture. And between what my clients have communicated and what I see online is this return to outside, which means people going back out to drive their cars and take the train. So there's a lot of congestion. I live in New York City, so there's tons of congestion here. And it seems like more people are here than ever before.
Right,
and,
yes. I thought they were leaving. Why are there so many?
I thought they were leaving too. So it feels like people returned and brought people with them. And that's also now increased the demand on people to return to the workplace. And several months ago, the conversations I was having when I was doing corporate wellness workshops was, well, we may go back or we may have a hybrid schedule. And I'm not exactly sure why this changed, but then a lot of clients were coming into sessions saying that their jobs were demanding that they return to work immediately. So they went from being home for maybe 16 months to within sometimes 2 weeks being told you have to return to work immediately.
Wow.
Yeah.
The thing about that, too, that is working from home, while I understand there are some jobs, make sense, one has to be on site, but for so many of them, just the time that you lose in commuting alone doesn't really justify that kind of archaic view on having everyone in the office all the time.
Exactly. And now with more people traveling and more people having a lot of transitions that they've just recently come through, it doesn't allow for special accommodations. I have clients who are now either recovering from COVID or have long COVID. I have clients who are caretakers. I have clients who have a variety of different things that have come through the pandemic with them. And as a result, need some accommodations with either working a different set of hours or a different time of day or being able to have some flexibility. And there are some corporations that are providing that, but I can sense the sensation or the fear that folks have that if they allow one employee to do this, everyone will ask for this. And I think we have to be creative.
Even so, if everyone asks for it, if they need it.
Yeah.
Interesting. When, just to go back in time for a moment, when did you know that you wanted to have a career helping people?
Oh my gosh, my entire life. I actually knew I wanted to be a professional helper since the age of 4, but I thought I would be a nurse. I still don't know why I chose that profession as early in life as I did, but I always thought I'd be a professional nurse. And I actually went to college to become a registered nurse. And I thought I would specialize in some type of occupational therapy as a specialty. But as time went on and I switched my career path, I was fortunate enough to still interface with the medical profession and did a lot of home care and community work and consultations. But I've known my entire life that this is what I wanted to do.
That's lucky for you. And so how did the move to a master's in social work happen?
Well, the short of it is I failed my exam in nursing school. I was in my second year
Love
and
the honesty.
yeah, I think people should know because nursing school is tough.
It is.
It's really, really hard. And nurses, I don't think, receive the respect that they're due. I
Yes.
was a very academic student all my academic career, but after graduating high school and going into college, and I went to a college that was pretty prestigious and known for their nursing program, it was rigorous. And I studied around the clock and just barely made it.
Yeah, it's tough. I know it's almost like what a doctor was 40 years ago with all the inorganic, organic chemistry, but
Absolutely. And after, studying around the clock and being exhausted and putting on the freshman 20, I really was probably experiencing my first round of burnout before I knew what that was and was super unhappy and was afraid to tell my parents. But, they surprised me and they just said, look, if this is not what you want to do, figure out what you want to do. Basically, choose your happiness. It shocked me. And that gave me the courage to look into something else. And that went into social work and a graduate in social work and then postgraduate studies in psychoanalysis.
I was going to say, master's in social work is nothing to sneeze at. That is a really difficult as well. As I understand it, I want to make sure that I have this right. You pivoted midway through your career from more of a private practice. You might be seeing couples or individuals or groups, but my understanding was it was more from private practice to now what is more of a corporate and employee wellness. Is that, I just want to make sure that's correct
Yeah,
first.
no, that's
Okay,
accurate.
cool. Why did you make the shift? Did you see a gap in the marketplace?
Well, two things, just to be as clear as I can be. I still have private practicing individuals. I don't do couples work as much anymore or group work, but the clients that I've been seeing for several years do trauma informed work with me, and that work is very slow paced. So I continue to see those clients. I just haven't opened my practice in the last several years to new clients. The pivot came when I knew that most people were spending their day and sometimes their night at work. And I started to really acutely pay attention to the things that my individual clients in therapy were reporting to me, and sometimes my couples as well, where it wasn't this 9 to 5 or 10 to 6 schedule anymore, but it was more of like a 10-hour, sometimes 12-hour shift. People were picking up the phone or their emails on weekends. And so as I paid close attention to that, I was like, oh, wow, this is why more people are coming into therapy. It's not just we're dealing with anxiety and or depression, but we're dealing with a massive fatigue that's going on around the globe. And so folks don't quite feel equipped to say to their boss, hey, I can't work on weekends or I can't take on this project, because I think there was a time in the workforce where if you said those things, you would feel the threat of, well, you don't have to, we could always replace you.
Absolutely.
you
Honestly,
know?
I feel like it still kind of is there. Personally.
Yeah, I notice it occasionally, but I think there's much more leverage now with employees being able to, in some ways, write their own ticket. Now, we know from research that the shift towards the way we used to work and more freelance work where people have flexibility and they can work remote is where the wave of the future is going. So just listening to people, watching people, seeing folks become increasingly exhausted and not knowing where there's an out was the reason why I said, well, look, if this is where people are spending most of their time, then why not speak to corporations about integrating wellness at work so people have some sense of agency, confidence in doing their work, feel like they belong to the community of people that they work with, and have a voice to be able to speak up to whomever. And that was in some ways easier than I thought because I didn't seek out that work initially. That work actually came to me, and I had already been doing workshops and seminars for years in my career, but it was in person. Now it was remote. And so just from doing work like this, speaking to the media about anxiety and stress at work and talking to people, then that work actually hit my computer by people reaching out and saying, oh, I heard your voice here, or I read an article about what you do. Could you bring this into Zoom? Could we do this online? And that just opened up the gate for a lot of people to just want this kind of work done.
It reminds me of, in a certain way, how when I talk to tech entrepreneurs, there's a proof of concept. And in your case, the proof of concept was in talking to your clients and identifying this shift in the workplace and this issue that so many people, or issues that so many people are dealing with.
Exactly. I think if you just tune into a few people, you're most likely getting a sense of what's happening to most people.
Yes. And one question before we move into kind of the meat of your work, in my opinion, I don't know, maybe it's not yours, is I just wanted to ask if you have any tips for people who are solopreneurs who might want to scale to a model like you have, where they are working with corporations. While it sounds like your growth was kind of more organic, are there tips that you have for someone considering doing that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question because as a clinician, I think one of the downfalls of people who are solopreneurs is the idea of being stuck in working in a solo practice of whatever industry you work in. And that's probably the downfall and the health risk for a lot of people who do so, because when you work as a solo practitioner, you tend to do all the jobs of someone who runs a small business. So you're the administrative assistant and you're the practitioner and you're the face of the company. You speak to the media. You're the one marketing your business. And I understand that in the beginning of a business, I mean, I was at a beginning before. I didn't have the capital to hire assistants, but because we're not oftentimes trained in how to run a large business, we don't often think about what large businesses have that we could scale back into running a small business, such as hiring a virtual assistant or investing in a small business coach or adding services that allow for you to reach more people by doing more group work as opposed to one-to-one work, which tends to burn out people faster. So I want people to really start practicing putting down some short-term goals around how to relieve yourself of doing all the things that you do and actually investing in people who could do things that are either specialties for them, or they do well, or they do with a passion, and just do a little research and find out how affordable that actually is. You could go online and find lots of contractors instead of hiring full-time staff that you could just hire on a project basis, or hire for a few hours a week to do your social media or to do your bookkeeping, or even just to become maybe a part-time virtual assistant. And then that gives you time back to building out your work or marketing your work differently, or even building in services that will reach a broader base of people.
Absolutely. And another part of that is opportunity cost, the cost of you doing, say, accounting, something I hate, rather than focusing on, what might be benefiting my podcast. There's the cost of that as well, right?
Absolutely, because when you're so focused on many things, you overlook the one thing that you can really do well if you put all of your attention there.
Very true. Let's talk about what the media has gone crazy over, the Great Resignation. For listeners, can you explain what the term means to you and what the catalysts were?
Yeah, so the Great Resignation is just what we know it to be. It's the mass exodus of employees from the workforce as we've once known it. So people are not returning to or seeking employment in jobs where the corporations don't offer something that's also going to benefit their livelihood, their health, their family life. People have now reevaluated what matters to them, and wellness matters, and time spent away from the desk, in front of a computer, in front of Zoom, with people they love, being close, feeling like they're a part of a community is really valuable. And it, in some ways, goes back to the period where we did leave work earlier. We were home for dinner. We sat at the table with our families. We talked about our day, and we had time to ourselves after dinner. Now everyone's going from working all day right to the bed because they're exhausted, or in front of the TV, munching and watching television. So I love that it's shifted in that way. And I think the Great Resignation has just allowed people to have a greater perspective and valuation for themselves and their lives.
I love that. And data always plays a role. So I just wanted to know the most recent stats. And what I found is that in the US, there are 11 million job openings. There's a 4.2% unemployment rate. This is interesting to me. Nearly 7 million people are looking for jobs, and low wage sectors are struggling to find workers, understandably, because people want to be earning more. As a professional helping employers trying to retain talent and reduce burnout, what do these numbers mean to you?
A lot of things. One, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is it gives employees a lot more leverage than we've ever seen before to ask for what they want and to negotiate earlier in the process of either looking for work or being in a job and wanting to pivot departments or positions. And now I think people feel more confident that they can do that, particularly when you see companies in all industries incentivizing people with sign-on bonuses and 2 weeks off for mental health, or extra time to travel, or school education credits. So there's so many things now that employees can negotiate at the beginning stages of interviewing that wasn't there in the past. And so that actually gives, I think, employers a different perspective of the value of employees and making business more people oriented as opposed to what it's been, which is more productivity driven. I think you can have both. I think you have to be invested, however, in the well-being of the people who you hire. You have to vet people well and trust that you've hired the people that you thought were for the job, and also working alongside with your employees to periodically appraise the work and how they're doing, as opposed to waiting a much longer time later to then at your annual evaluation tell people how well or not so well you think they've been doing. So it creates much more community. And I think it also dismantles that hierarchy. If your boss is above you, there's some mystery of a person that's, in control of your destiny. And so I think for a lot of reasons, employers are shifting and becoming a lot more humble. And I think it allows people to actually have more agency over their livelihood.
Which is positive no matter how one looks at it, because having agency and feeling like you have some control over your life is so important. I was wondering while I was listening to you, do you think that more, or have you seen more employers be open to what they call upstream appraisals, or employees also giving their managers reviews, because we're all works in progress?
Yeah, I've definitely heard about the latter a lot more than I did in my career when I worked for other corporations. So yeah, someone recently in one-to-one therapy expressed the same information to me, that they appraise their employer. And I think that's great. They appraise the company and they appraise their manager. And I think that's great. I think managers need to hear from their staff how they're doing, because ultimately managers work for their employees, not the other way around.
Yes.
And I think we've for so long seen them as untouchable and omnipotent. And that's absolutely not true. I feel like now this allows for people to develop more mutuality and respect and trust for the working environment, and that everyone is coming to work for something. It's not a place where you just come to participate in whatever you do for the job, but you actually come because you want to feel like your contributions matter, that you're being seen, that you're growing, that you're possibly being mentored, so that should you leave the company or you change departments, you feel like you've gone from step 5 to step 10 before you've shifted. And I think that's really important, especially for the younger professionals in the workforce.
Yes. And I was going to ask also, you had said negotiating at the beginning, like when you're interviewing, but if someone is currently in a role and they like it, but they do want to negotiate a better package, I assume you would also advocate for that.
Yes. So one of the things I've noticed, because I particularly work with millennials and a few Gen Xers, one of the things that I find really striking about millennials is they're quite aware of what's happening in the world. They know what people are being paid in other positions similar to theirs in in other communities and other companies, and they want to grow. They want to learn. They want to absorb. They want to be better at what they do. And so I help clients to strategize with their manager for those appraisals to come not at the year mark, but maybe at the 6-month mark. I help them to strategize certain goals that they want to achieve and work those goals so that they can inquire within the company for either educational credits that they can learn and add to their resume, or partnering maybe with someone else in a different department where they can complement the job and do things that are a little bit different than what they are doing every day, which gives people a lot more zest for work and it's less monotonous. And then have a plan that you email your manager and sit down with your manager, schedule a time periodically to check in so that they can evaluate you quarterly as to your progress, how they feel you're doing with your goals. Be very clear about what you're there to do, what you want to learn, and whom you want to mentor you, so that there is some type of accountability in you meeting those goals. And send that to your manager with some deadlines for yourself to set an appointment and appraise those goals and look for feedback in your progress. I find that a lot of people want to be rewarded for their work, but they haven't stretched themselves. They haven't accounted for new skills they've acquired. They haven't been studying something that brings value to the corporation or their position. They just want the money that they think someone else is being paid. But you need to have clear, defined goals and reasons, rationale for why you deserve that. And that comes with being clear about what it is that you're trying to learn, what your contributions do for your team and the corporation, and making that a clearly defined plan for yourself that you share with your manager. So when you have those quarterly meetings, you can assess if you've met those goals. Try to ground yourself in some kind of evidence of what you're there to do or learn or grow from, and put some kind of framework around when those goals will be met.
I so love that on so many levels because, firstly, it's giving people agency to really look at themselves and say, what is it that I want to do? You also address the point of it. Yes, it's what you want to do, but it also kind of has to make sense in the context of the organization. And so, there's a little bit of back and forth, but it's basically taking your career in your hands and making yourself accountable. And I think that when people in general come to someone with a plan, I think oftentimes it's very much appreciated.
Absolutely. Because I'm so fortunate I get to work on both sides. I get to work with people who are employed professionals, and I get to work with corporations on the leadership side. I'm able to shift between the two and really inform each other of what really the needs and wants are of each person. And because I do that work with my individual clients, I think it helps them to see that this is not just like you show up for work, like you went to your high school class and you sat down and someone
Right.
fed you the information, you took notes, and then you left in case Saran, so you had to take your test. It's like, no, working is different. Working is about contributing to the greater goal of whatever corporation you're working for. It's about you really taking initiative. It's about being resolution oriented, task focused. That's what companies hire people for. And we know that, and that's never going to change. So you have to be realistic about what you expect, not just of a company, but of yourself, to not just sit like a bump on a log and collect a paycheck every 2 weeks. You need to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. You need to participate and take initiative. You need to be able to speak up when something happens sooner than later. You need to allow your supervisor or manager to get to know you, right? Have some professional boundaries, of course, but definitely become visible. Don't sit in the back of the class, so to speak, and expect to be seen. You have to get up and you have to talk and you have to engage and you have to let people know that you're here and this is what you're talented in. This is how intelligent you are. This is what you're here to learn. And then be open to actually getting the feedback that's going to critique your work, not personalize it as if it's critiquing you, but also be aware of some of the things that maybe you need that challenge you to do something other than just being your comfort zone.
I think that's so true. And I also think, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes it's okay to be a bump on the log for a little while if you have other stuff going on in your life and you just want to have that 6 months or year where you're just collecting a paycheck, doing your work, of course, because we're all balancing, right?
Mhm. I think we're constantly trying to figure out what works best for us. And so I often think of us as human beings not being necessarily in balance, but being in harmony. And I think harmony looks different. Harmony for me looks more like, what's the thing that I can put my motivation, my interest, my concentration on for the moment. And I think this speaks to what you're saying, until I need to shift. And how do I know I need to shift? Well, sometimes you know you need to shift because the work becomes monotonous, or you haven't learned something new in 6 months, or you're not quite aware of what's going on in the company, or you don't know what your manager's looking for from you. That's why it's important to have those periodic check-ins, you know?
Makes a lot of sense. The term toxic has permeated our lexicon, and I'm not saying that in a way like I'm making fun of it because I think these things happen for a reason. So, in terms of workplace, how do you define a toxic workplace?
Toxic workplace for me is grounded in some of the theory of microaggression. Dr. Daryl Sue Wing, who created that term that we've heard for so long, but maybe didn't quite understand. Microaggressions are those subtle nuances that occur in communication between one person and another, where the person who is on the receiving end feels victimized. So that may sound like being invalidated. How did you get this position? Might be a question towards someone of a particular gender or ethnic group, or someone being asked like, oh, where's your family from? They don't necessarily mean within the States if you appear to be other. So micro assaults on people. And so the way in which toxicity for a lot of people who are in marginalized groups comes across is just that way. It's subtle. It feels very assaultive on a person's being. It's oftentimes not recognized by the person who's assaulting the other person verbally. And it's sometimes hard to prove because it's a subjective experience. And in the workplace, particularly for people who've been marginalized, whether they're in the BIPOC group, Black, Indigenous, person of color, or they're in the LGBT group, or they're a veteran, or they have a disability, any of the groups that are considered other are oftentimes found to feel the oppression of what we consider toxicity in the workplace. And as a result of that, it's created a climate of work that has not allowed for people in marginalized groups to feel they have the opportunity to thrive as other professionals. And so I think it's not only toxic in terms of those systems have endured, but is toxic in the way that it actually penetrates one's psychology, their emotional health, their confidence at work, their ability to be recognized for opportunities for growth, professional growth and development. And also in terms of pay and income, it puts them in a margin much lower than people who are in other groups that are deemed as more respected or knowledgeable or worthy of these positions that hold power.
I believe that one of the stats that you shared with me earlier had to do with PTSD and people of color, that being the most common workplace diagnosis, I think. I want to make sure I'm getting this right. And it's because of these microaggressions, etc.
Yeah, there's so many things. When I think about professor and researcher Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term intersectionality, which basically means the parallels between two or more oppressed groups. So maybe a Black woman of the LGBT community or a disabled veteran. These groups that oftentimes go overlooked are experiencing so much internal anxiety, self doubt, fear of being recognized for things, but also what I often hear, especially with women of color, is this push to overproduce and not be validated or recognized for their contributions. And even in some cases, I'm sure women of other ethnic groups and races find this to be true too, your work being taken by someone else and then reported as if it's theirs, which is fraud. And
Yeah.
so for so many people,
It's
it's not,
infuriating. Oh,
it's
I'm laughing, but I'm like
infuriating.
angry. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen that with my own two eyes. I've been in workspaces where that's happened before. And I think for so many people who are in one or more marginalized communities has experienced that as a part of a majority of their working career. And only until recently, maybe didn't know that that was microaggressive or insulting or invalidating and didn't have the power to really speak upon it, because in most cases you might be the minority in the office or in the department in which you work. And if you're in one of these industries like fintech or administration, where there's probably one every couple of miles, right? One woman
Yes.
or one minority, then your alignment with someone similar to you is very far and few in between. So you feel a lot of fear around speaking up for retaliation or rejection or being further isolated. And all of those different experiences creates in people a lot of hypervigilance around, well, when do I talk, or who do I talk to, or who can I trust? It creates a sense of mistrust and self-doubt. And for a lot of people, I think makes them not only anxious in the workplace, but of course they carry that around in their bodies outside of the workplace. And that gets passed down from generation to generation.
Yes, absolutely. And the stories, yes, 100%. It's just really resonating with me because I'm dealing with something with one of my daughters that is like this, and I've seen how it affects her at home. And, it can be benign on the surface to people around, but to the person it's happening to, it's not benign at all.
At all.
And it's right. So how can, whether it's a school, whether it's an employer, how can they do a better job of expressing that the lines of communication are open and that there isn't going to be retaliation or retribution because you come forward?
Two things have to occur at the same time. This is very archaic, but it works. Old things work well sometimes. I tell people who express maybe the not quite clear impression of what they think is going on. So they're not sure, but they're bringing it to someone else's attention. I encourage people to start writing things down soon after they occur, but also bring your notebook. Like go back to writing things in a notebook and bring your notebook into a meeting. Bring your notebook into your one-to-one meeting with your manager and record what the topic was for the hour or what topics were brought up in the conversation, who responded, what the response was. In some ways, this is how I was trained as a clinician. We used to literally what we call write progress notes and process notes. And process notes were where we had to write verbatim as much as we could remember the client said. That's
Wow.
worked. Yeah, that's worked over and over in coaching people and in consulting and counseling people to keep a record of contact and whatever steps you took. Did you go to HR? Did you request a meeting and then give a timeline for a follow-up with your manager about a request you made? Did you ask for maybe other things that you didn't know were available to you to be supported in your work, whether it's training, etc.? And keep a record of that. And then send those notes to yourself if you're writing them down or if you're creating emails so that you can have a thread, copy and paste it to your manager. So every meeting has a follow-up note with this is what occurred and these are some of the goals and tasks and these are the deadlines for follow-up. Keep track of that, okay? Because that's going to be the protection you need should you have to escalate a grievance to HR or further to the legal department. Do that repeatedly. And for corporations, make it explicit in your protocol, in your employee handbook, what policies and practices are in place to protect people. Make it clear and explicit for employees to take regular mandatory trainings online around workplace aggression. Make it clear as to what the fixed policies and practices are of the corporation to support people when they have a grievance. So there's not this sort of like evasive, I think this company doesn't tolerate discrimination, but it's made clear and it's reinforced and it's repeated. So there's this high standard as to what the company's mission is, which again has to be people focused and it has to protect the people that they serve and have a third party mediator. I used to do this in my work with kids and families in the South Bronx, where we would have a third party mediator mediate between two groups. And sometimes that included HR, but sometimes it just included someone maybe in a different department that was neutral, that could sit down and sort of hold court, so to speak, with both parties to let out their grievances and then end the meeting with some kind of plan of action that that mediator will help both parties to come back to so we could see if there's any change or progress in resolving whatever we're trying to do here. And so that has helped people to feel as if there's someone else accountable to leading the pathway for people to feel there's more liberty here, for people to respect difference and to be able to speak up when they feel disrespected or invalidated at work. I don't want to encourage this idea that we're trying to threaten people, right? So that might be in some ways people interpreting it as such. But I think what we need instead is for this power dynamic that often occurs between two different groups of people to not be sort of like the implicit thing that's tolerated in the workplace, which it has been for so long, without it going addressed and having real policies in place to address it early and continually.
Yes. And with that in mind, we've talked about burnout, we've talked about microaggressions. Are there certain issues that you hear expressed resoundingly with employees? And then I'm curious about employers as well.
Yeah, so some of the expressed needs and concerns of employees are wanting to have their work respected for the contributions that they make, something I've been saying throughout this entire conversation, and that there's an equity, that everyone is given an opportunity to shine. So for those people who might be a little bit more introverted, you may not need that, microscope view, but for some people, it's important even just subtly to just acknowledge one to one, you're doing a good job, or we appreciate what you've said this evening at, our meeting, or whatever it is. So acknowledging people's contributions is number one. It's what every employee needs, but it's often what marginalized people feel doesn't occur. The other thing that people have expressed to me that they need and they've noticed hasn't been occurring is being, again, rewarded for their contributions at a time, particularly when they've brought something more to the table than just their basic responsibilities under the role that they play at work. So that's being compensated. There's too many times I've noticed where employees are spending extra hours at work or taking on other people's jobs when the company loses employees, and there's no conversation around compensation. Now, compensation doesn't always include financial compensation, but it can and it should. But what about comping your time? If you're going to spend 3 extra hours at work, then why not come in 3 extra hours late? Or,
Absolutely.
shaving it off the end of your day at the end of the week, or adding it to your PTO. So being able to negotiate what compensation means, which could really help people who have vulnerability to burnout not to burn out. And that's what a lot of people need, and they're not receiving, and they're complaining about from the employee side. On the employer side, I think there's a mystery as to what employees are actually experiencing outside of work that comes into work with them. And that goes both ways. That goes from employees not being forthcoming with their managers earlier on when there's a shift in their lives outside of work that affects their mental health at work. And I also think that there's sometimes this lack of interest that appears on the employer side, or lack of emotional intelligence, honestly, around what's appropriate. What's the appropriate question to ask an employee if I notice that there seems to be something different with them? How do I ask? When do I ask and inquire? And you want to be respectful of that, because if it's not clear, if you're not aware of those boundaries at work, you may avoid them, especially if you have a personality that's more avoidant type. So I think for the employer, it's also important to be curious about your employees, be genuinely curious, do group checks with people. So again, it feels like everyone belongs, but also do periodic individual check-ins with people to not just sit and talk about work, but really talk about where we are in the world, how we're impacted by it, what's going on in the community in which maybe marginalized people particularly deal with every day, and how is that impacting the way that they show up to work, and what can the company offer them for that? What kind of resources are there that maybe haven't been highlighted so that they can tap into? Be kind and curious, be intrinsically attentive, and do it in such a way that's not going to make people feel like you're hounding them for information, but that really your door is open.
Right. It's genuine and authentic.
It's authentic.
Yeah, absolutely. That gave me so much to think about all at once. Small business owners are in a tough place in the sense that, there's a lot of startups. There's this culture of, we're going to pay you with equity, whatever it is. And as a result, there's really no HR. How can small businesses boost the morale of their employees? This is kind of a tough question for me to ask because I'm wondering if it's difficult, like you can pay someone a certain amount and you're upfront with them, you're honest with them, but small businesses don't have, say, the resources of you. So where can they look for resources?
Where can a small business owner look for resources? Well, it depends upon what resources you're looking for. For me, as a small business owner, it wasn't so clear to me when I founded my company almost 8 years ago what I needed. I was just so thrilled to be able to have a skill that was marketable. And I was eager to learn a lot of different parts of running a company. I didn't go to B school, but I learned by being adjacent to other
Doing.
people. Yeah, and being doing it exactly and being adjacent to other people who had small businesses, mostly private practices. And I asked a lot of questions. And at that time, before 8 years ago, the people that I spoke to were generally people who were a lot older than me, who ran small practices, and they had that mentality of you do it all. You do your bookkeeping, you do, your clinical notes, you make all your appointments yourself. I just thought that was absurd. and and so for me, I started to do community research and I found the Small Business Administration. And I think a lot of times because we're new to running a business, if you're coming from a family like mine who didn't have small business owners, everyone worked for someone else their entire career. I actually did community research to find what was available to me in the community. And in doing that, I learned about the Small Business Administration and the free courses they offered by experts in various industries. So that's where I learned how to do a financial plan. I learned how to write a business plan. I learned how to do my own social media initially. And as I grew, I stayed involved with them so that as new developments came about in grants for small businesses or small minority owned businesses or how to certify your business as a small minority owned business, then I would also tap into other resources, accountant services that were available. All these things are pro bono in community based businesses, right? And sometimes
Yes.
you'll be surprised, even asking people or cold calling people, as I once did, for resources. Like if I saw an organization that was in my community and they had been thriving for X number of years and they had, a large clientele, sometimes I would actually inquire if I could take a meeting with maybe the person who was the practitioner there or someone in the organization that could sit with me and give me some sense of guidance as to what to do. Now that everything is online, I'll still do that. I encourage my colleagues, book a 15-minute tea date with someone on LinkedIn, be clear about what you learned about them, why you're reaching out, how much of their time you need, and have 3 or 4 questions during that meeting that you want to ask. Be
I love
aggressive in
that.
some ways. Yeah. I think people are too shy about asking strangers for help. The worst they could say is no, or they could ignore you, but so what?
Exactly. It's so true. Oh, that has made my day. I'm going to do that after this podcast. Okay.
It helps tremendously, but I think we need more of that.
Yes, I completely agree. And LinkedIn is a great resource for it. Let's just, as we end the podcast, I just wanted to, it's a very important topic and something that I know is close to your heart, which is workplace discrimination. You work closely with Black and Latinx workers and professionals. And one of the data points that I got, it was from Glassdoor, but they must have a lot of data, is nearly half of Black and Hispanic job seekers and employees have quit jobs after witnessing or experiencing discrimination at work. That, first of all, was shocking to me. And that was compared with, I think, 38% of white. And they don't say whether it's men or women. But since you do specialize in working with Black and Latinx employees, is this stat what you're seeing and hearing? And have you experienced it yourself?
Yes, yes, and yes.
That's the short answer.
That's the short of it. I would say really quickly, I have seen it and I've seen it in phases. So this is what I mean, Dory, when I say in phases. I've seen, because I'm a participant in this, I've seen employees of color come to me for leaves of absence, as I mentioned earlier. Those leaves of absence generally start with short-term leave, but they advance to long-term leave. And long-term leave may mean that people are actually disabled by work and they can't return. So what does that look like? Someone applies for short-term disability. They may be able to take 4.5 to 6 months of leave from their job if their job duties actually exacerbate their symptoms, and the job will replace their income by a third party vendor, i.e., an insurance company that will then provide for income, not necessarily at 100%, but sometimes 60 to 80% for several weeks. When they don't return to work after 4.5 or 6 months of leave and their symptoms remain the same or worsen and they have to go into long-term disability, now again, they may never return to work. I've seen people take short-term disability, return to work after several weeks, and then actually resign. So sometimes it happens, as I'm mentioning, in these phases. That's one way that Black and Brown people have gotten out of the corporate conventional job market. Another way has been through what I did initially. What happened to me was in two different situations. I felt pushed out from my job. I was working in a corporation that was very well known and was growing rapidly and changing rapidly, which meant administration was changing and your managers were shifting and you were losing staff, but the company kept growing. And so that meant my position and role kept changing. I kept shifting from one department to another as various departments were closing. And I ended up being under the guise of someone who was in a different industry but adjacent. And they were very aggressive and they had a lot of nepotism and favoritism in the office. And it was also coming across as if people who challenged their authority was seen as a threat. And so I was actually forced out after highlighting some of the things that I found very threatening and very concerning. And they put me on a what they call a PIP, which probably a lot of people know, but one of these individualized plans to help me to improve, while I saw colleagues next to me that were leaving work early and coming in late and doing half the work I was doing. And so that happened to me twice. And I went to another company and worked my butt off, and it was never enough. And as people left the organization rapidly and we had constant changeover, I kept being put into these roles to do jobs that I wasn't qualified for. And I said yes a lot because I didn't feel I could say no. And the time that I did say no, they actually let me go. So that was disheartening. And I've been through that. And I understand when it's happening to other employees that it's a real phenomenon and I believe them. So I think now as well, when I walk outside, finally, I walk outside and I look around, I see a lot more minority owned businesses than I've ever seen before. That was growing in my community in New York before the pandemic, but now I'm seeing it online. I'm seeing advertising for things like home care services and child care services and domestic work. And I mean, like a lot of different kinds of services, including professional services, consulting on how to change your resume, career coaching. I'm seeing a lot more growth in professional services too. And so, yes,
Yes.
it's happening across the board. It's happened to me. I've seen it happen with my clients, and it's based in my believability. I believe them. I believe myself when it's happened to me, and I believe them when they say it's happening to them at work, that they have been invalidated over and over. They've been disrespected. They have been embarrassed and shamed in front of their colleagues. They've been talked down to, and they've been overlooked for positions when they've said yes a lot of times.
I just want to say I'm so sorry that that happened. That really was painful to hear.
Thank you. That means so much to hear.
Yeah. You hear it from other people all the time, but it happened to you. And the way you spoke of it really saddens me that that happened.
Yeah, it's a risk. And I understand why so many people are afraid when I advise them to speak up at work, because there is the potential of you being retaliated against. That's a real occurrence for a lot of people who are marginalized. But I think now, as things are slightly shifting, it's still important to speak up. It's just important as well to know when to speak up, to whom, and how to go about doing it, and always protect yourself by keeping records.
Yes, and you gave great tips on that. So, the last two questions I have, if you are in a toxic environment right now in the workplace, it could be in a relationship, and for whatever reason you are not able to leave at in the next week, month, are there any tips that you can give a person to get through to where they need to, the other side, and kind of prepare. The preparation, I think, is in the documentation and all of that. But for themselves and for their mental health, what can they do while they are trying to make their situation better for themselves?
Yeah, or even have an exit strategy.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of small steps, these minute things that we can do. And it may seem simple, but simple sometimes is best. I want people to know that they should have a strategy regardless of if they stay in a corporation and shift departments, or they actually want an exit strategy because the company doesn't align with their values, to consider what they can get before they leave. Now, this may sound very self-focused, but it actually needs to be self-focused. If you're already at the point of mental exhaustion, frustration, even some resentment, you like dread going to work, then you're hitting the wall, right? You're hitting that burnout wall and you need to act quickly. So one of the things I encourage people to do is do an appraisal of your budget and start looking realistically at your budget every single week where you spend money, and see where you can scale back on things that are not necessities. Because should you have to leave your job immediately, or should you have to leave at a time you really didn't expect, then you want to be able to have income that you're supporting yourself off of right now to just cover your basic living needs. I'm not saying do without pleasure, but some of the things that we have in our budget are not necessities. They're just things we want. We have some membership somewhere and we never go to this thing that we are a member of.
Exactly.
So scale your budget.
Discretionary income. Yeah.
Exactly. Also, look into, before you get to the point where you just want to leave immediately, get to the place where you can speak to your HR representative or your financial planner about your assets. For a lot of folks who've been working maybe 10 plus years, at minimum 10 years, you probably have already been contributing to your 401k, your pension. Maybe you have a third party insurance that you've been paying into. Should you become disabled, even mentally, and you need to take some time off, that might cover some parts of your income. So look into your investments and see if you need to strategize to take leave or you need to exit sooner than later. What income do you already have readily available to you or that you can access to cover your expenses for? You probably need at least a year and a half. I wouldn't encourage people probably under a year to do this, because we're looking at all kinds of things now in the economy in terms of where people are going to work and how they're going to work. So have some kind of conversation with someone who is an overseer of your other investments so that you could use that if you need to leave. The other thing to do is, if there is no HR department or there is no third party that you could speak to that's neutral, a lot of times, especially for people who don't think of themselves as being privileged or having access to resources that privileged people do, you may have a legal department either adjacent to your organization that they use for some reason that you can tap into, or look into some legal resources in your community, whether it's through the Department of Labor or it's through the Small Business Association. There are some attorneys that will do pro bono work and or consult with you and maybe redirect you to a place where you can do some kind of have legal representation through an organization that does sliding scale. I think so much of what we experience in the job, we feel narrowed to just accessing those things, but also there are places where you can go to and access those things right in your neighborhood. And maybe you just didn't know that, so that you can at least get consult on labor laws and protection and just a plan of action for yourself. So I would tell people to do those things.
I love the pragmatism in everything that you've said. My last question is, one of the things you say on your website is going from the Great Resignation to the Great Recovery.
Yeah.
I hope that's what it was, because that's what I
Yeah.
remember it being.
You got it.
It really struck me. And it obviously nothing can be distilled down to one thing. But if there were one thing in 2022 that you would like to see employers and employees alike embrace, what might that be?
I have an answer in short. Give employees their time back. That's ultimately what can help mitigate some burnout. Give people their time back. cut back on the expectation for employees to work more hours than is humanly possible. Our brains reach a certain capacity where we can no longer mentally integrate information coming in or putting it out. And so for someone, that might mean at 3 o'clock, your blood sugar drops and you need to have a snack. Get up and move from your desk, go get water, get fresh air and sunshine for 15 minutes, get a snack, come back, and okay, let's see how you do for the next 2 hours. But pushing people beyond their limits, making unreasonable expectations the standard for working and for what everyone else, quote unquote, does is unreasonable. It's really irrational too. And it's not fair when everyone has a different capacity for things. So give people their time back. These wellness workshops that we're actually no longer doing in my organization, we've created instead a 6-month curriculum that's trauma informed that gives employees their time back. And what that means is no longer can people sit still in front of a Zoom after they've been on Zoom every day of the week for an hour each session and do this rote, mundane, feeding you information, maybe giving you an exercise to do, and then leaving, expecting you to be better, healthier, more stable, more clear in your thinking. So now we're looking at more frequency in contact with employees, but doing sessions for 30 minutes and integrating more somatic or body work that they can implement immediately throughout the day and repeatedly when they feel distressed. This way, we help teach people how to take care of themselves while working so that it produces more ease with work and gives people more confidence that they can do their job with clarity, focus, and concentration. And this way, they're not rushing from a workshop in 60 minutes to the next meeting for another hour or two, but cutting it and slicing it back to 30 minutes helps them to actually feel more at ease with transitioning and give themselves some sense of reprieve before planning for the next thing they have to do for the day. If we start to practice that and we model that with the work day and we scale back on the hours, people actually feel like, I have some energy after work. I can go do other things. I can be more attentive to my family. I can work out. I can eat better and make healthier life choices. And that's what I'm hoping this program will do.
You hear that, world? I couldn't agree more. Where can listeners learn more about you and any programs?
Definitely go to my website, Life Coach Asha, ASHA, lifecoachasha.com, and learn a little bit more about some of the work that I'm doing for corporate wellness and book an exploratory call so we can see if this is a good fit for your organization. And let's work to get people back to work and keep them at work, but more satisfied, with more energy and feeling more belonging.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing a wealth of knowledge today.
Thank you so much, Doria, for having me. It was great.
You've been listening to She Ventures. Like what you heard? You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.